let me introduce another optimist, Dambisa Moyo, a pragmatic optimist, we should say. Dambisa, welcome so much to our Techonomy and Worth, Health and Wealth of America conference. Dambisa is a unique figure in global public dialogue and economics, in that she is fearless about saying whatever she figures out. And she's very thoughtful, so she figures out a lot of stuff. And it sometimes is not the conventional wisdom, which we love. And we're very eager to hear some of that non-conventional wisdom today. So welcome, Dambisa. I'm going to quickly just mention some of your books, your many books. You have a book just coming out now called How Boards Work, and how they can work better in a chaotic world. We're not going to talk too much about that topic today. Our topic today, which will be diverse, but a lot of it's going to include the US system and what its prospects are, particularly in light of China's successes and influence and power. You wrote a book called Winner Take All, China's Race for Resources. You wrote a book called The Edge of Chaos, Why Democracy is Failing to Deliver Economic Growth. You wrote a book called How the West Was Lost, 50 Years of Economic Folly. And the book that really first put you on the map, Dead Aid, Why Aid is Not Working and How There's a Better Way for Africa. That book was such a major, impactful thing that Dambisa really has been very prominent on the global scene of thinking about our global problems ever since. She's also, though, I think unlike a lot of public intellectuals, very much a pro-business thinker. And she's on the board of Chevron and also 3M, which I think gives her a lot of standing to write her new book on boards. But anyway, Dambisa, so many things to talk to you about, and welcome.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
So let me just start by asking you for your big picture view of where we are in the world, in the United States, in business, in the economy, as COVID, we hope, is starting to wane, and so much has changed in this intervening year.
Well, look, listen, I think what's really important is context. And actually, before we hit COVID in earnest in 2020, the global economy was already in a precarious situation. If you looked at the global forecasts for growth, they were already trending lower. Just as a rule of thumb, we need to be growing by 3% per year in order to double per capita incomes in a generation, which is about 25 years. Already before COVID hit in Q4 of 2019, Germany was recording a 0% growth rate. GDP was 0% in Germany. The UK was already reporting a 1.2 to 1.4 growth rate for much of 2019. And really looking around the globe, the large emerging market economies, remembering that 90% of the world's population lives in the emerging markets. I'm talking about countries that have at least 50 million people, like Brazil, South Africa, Russia, etc., were already growing at numbers slower than that magic 3% number. But in addition to those growth forecasts, which obviously also suggested that equity returns were trending downwards, we were also concerned about the impotence of public policy. Again, before COVID, we had negative interest rates in Europe and in Japan. We were in a situation where the Congressional Budget Office was already cautioning about too much debt, certainly in the public balance sheets.
Isn't that funny? Oh, go on. Yeah.
And really saying that we were at risk, certainly the United States was at risk of not funding its entitlement programs, certainly by 2030. And, you know, I had written extensively that debt in every category, household debt, corporate debt, government debt, auto loans, student loans, was already at $1 trillion each pre-COVID. And then, of course, the bigger thing, which is really what was the backbone of my book, Edge of Chaos, was that there's a confluence of economic factors that were dragging down prospects from growth, from climate change to the risk of technology creating a jobless underclass, demographic shifts, both in terms of quality and quantity of the workforce, of course, inequality. All these aspects were, again, really worrisome before COVID. So where are we today? Clearly, with just the sheer wall of the stimulus, certainly in the West, which has been around 20% plus for most developed economies. Add
Wait,
to that
20% of
of
what is
monetary. So this is how much stimulus has been put into the system. 20% of GDP on average has been put into the system. Add to that the fact that the aggregate demand shock is being reversed. The fact that we were forced to stay home for a year, we're now going to be out post-vaccine. Those effects are, of course, going to contribute to a what I would call a rebound in terms of the markets. But I'm very worried about the fact that we are not in a recovery for a number of reasons. Yes, vaccinations are much more available in places like the United States. The estimates right now for India is that they will not reach herd immunity before February 2023. There are real concerns around inflation, which I'm sure we'll get into. And of course, that whole swathe of economic challenges that I've mentioned are still massive question marks from climate change, inequality, etc. So there's, what am I saying? I'm saying I'm sanguine in the short term. But if you look at even the IMF forecast post 2022, we start to see a material diminution in growth rates because we haven't dealt with these systemic problems that I outlined earlier.
Well, I know you also like to use the word deglobalization as something that is well underway. Explain what you mean by that and why you're worried about it.
So again, before COVID hit, deglobalization, and just thinking, let's take a step back and remember that globalization has really 5 pillars. We're talking about trade in goods and services. So obviously, which can be impacted by disrupted supply chains. So trade in goods and services is number 1. Capital flows, so the ability to move capital, investment capital across borders. A third one is just the movement of people. The migration is a third pillar of globalization. A fourth pillar is the idea that we have global standards, particularly in intellectual protocols. And then finally, global cooperation, really led by multilateral institutions over the past 50 years or so, post-Bretton Woods. However, all these 5 aspects of globalization are under threat. And again, This was before COVID and has been accelerated in the era of COVID. So if I think about trade, as I mentioned, the disruption in supply chains has really meant not only difficulty in moving goods and services over boundaries, but is really a contributor to this question about inflation as we start to turn inward to think about really sourcing from internal or domestic sources. In terms of capital flows, real risks around capital controls rising, the question about whether companies are going to be able to borrow, the famous carry trade, borrow cheaply in London and New York and invest in higher yielding risk adjusted returns in places like Brazil, incredibly challenged in a world where governments are desperate for more capital. Immigration, I mean, I don't need to say much more, not just because of what we've seen in the impetus for Brexit, but also in the United States, concerns around immigration are ongoing. The intellectual protocols point is really about the splinter net, the real threat that in the next decade, over this decade, we could see a split between a Chinese-led versus a US or Western-led platform and technology, which has material implications for running global businesses. And of course, if nothing else, COVID has highlighted the breakdown of global cooperation and the sort of global challenge to the multilateral institutions from Bretton Woods from 1944, like the World Bank and the IMF. We now have RCEP. We have the Belt and Road. We have real the sort of banking initiatives from China that are challenging that sort of global model. So in summation, yes, I think it's realistic for boards, for corporations, and for governments to think about those downward risks, but also opportunities for a world that's becoming more balkanized and more deglobalized.
Right, and I know your central concern about that, if I'm characterizing you right, which you should just say it yourself, but is that it will not help growth, which is the main thing we need, as you said at the beginning, right?
That's exactly right. In order to solve the human progress issues, delivery of healthcare, delivery of education, infrastructure, In order for us to actually solve these areas, climate change, this whole list of challenges the world is facing, there's no doubt in my mind we need economic growth. So any public policies that are seen to either keep the GDP pie stagnant or even shrink it, I do not think is going to help us address these very, very challenging issues that need to be addressed over time. So growth is the answer. Even before COVID, again, people were already campaigning against this notion of growth. Of course, there are some arguments about how we achieve that growth, but fundamentally, I do think that all these slogans of build back better, etc., are really attached to the need for economic growth, and we need to get back to that really fundamental principles on how we can deliver growth in this environment.
And I do want to get into the prospects for the U.S. per se in a little while, but when you think, one of the things I really like about talking with you is that you always think globally. That may be partly because even though you live in the United States, you were originally from Zambia, you are a global person. So when you say the world needs growth, you're not talking about American standards of living per se, although I assume they're implicated, but the idea that if we don't bring up everybody, we are all in trouble. Is that a fair statement?
That's exactly right. The notion that we can somehow be ring fenced and not worry about what's happening elsewhere is folly. And I hark back to what I said a moment ago. Yes, many of us will be on July 4th at barbecues and having a great time and thinking about traveling again. But we have to understand that India, just in the last 24 hours, Prime Minister Boris Johnson in the UK has been talking about the surge in cases in India. We are not out of the woods with respect to new strains. Those other countries and economies are still having to deal with the real risk of a long tail with respect to herd immunity and getting vaccines.
One thing I just want to quickly touch on, which we didn't talk about when we talked about by phone the other day, but I'm curious your view. Immigration, you mentioned it earlier, but how much do you worry about massive uncontrolled migration and immigration and refugee flows if we don't take these global economic problems by the horn, so to speak, and really wrestle them to the ground so that everybody can come up?
Well, that's a brilliant question in two respects. Superficially, there shouldn't be any surprise that people will constantly be looking for opportunities to improve their lives. And in the extreme, we will see more disorderly migration as people worry about breakdown of the political systems in their homes. We've seen that in Europe most recently. We're seeing it on the southern border of the United States. In fact, if my estimates are correct, if you look at the research from the International Rescue Committee, IRC, they are talking about how we are now living in a world which is unprecedented, where we have at least 70 million people around the world who are displaced, either refugees or essentially displaced people. This is the first time we've ever seen this level of rates around the world. But the other point, which I think is critically important, is that as we pursue ESG, as an example, we have to remember the risks of these second order effects. In particular, there's a great impetus and momentum against defunding energy companies, as an example, in a very aggressive way. But that sort of breezes over the fact that to the extent that 1.5 billion people in the world have no access to energy today in a sustainable and cost-effective way, we have to make sure that we don't forget the risks of more immigration, those second-order effects, if we just were to become sort of short-term and not very innovative in terms of how we address climate change.
Okay, I mean, that we could go down that path in detail, although I don't have time. Many would rebut that by saying, what is the evidence that big energy companies are doing their best to help those 1.5 billion people get more energy? I guess I just said it. So what's your response to that?
Well, I can assure you. I mean, I sit at the sort of the three-way path of this intersection. I obviously was born and raised in Africa. Africa and Africans are among that 1.5 billion in a considerable way. My parents live there. We still have 16 hours a day where we have no energy. Think for a moment of students who had to go home because of the quarantine, who have not been able to dial into Zoom calls.
Right, but no offense, you're on the board of Chevron. How is Chevron solving?
I'm about to tell you.
Okay.
To tell you. This is not just about Chevron. It's about the energy community in general. We are invested real dollars, and not just in cash, but also in people, in every part of the stack. We're invested in solar, in water, in biofuels. We're investing in nuclear Gen 4. And I will just tell you and remind you, battery. I will remind you that there are 8 billion people on the planet. If we knew how to solve this problem at scale, we would know the answer. The fact that we are continuing to make efforts and put real capital, real human capital and cash to this problem should tell you that this is a very complicated issue. And I worry very much that the conversation is at a very banal level, given what's at stake.
Okay, to answer Frederick Guarino's question you just put in the Q&A, ESG, you're not opposed to it. You think it is key. It's just we have to be more pragmatic about what really is good for environment, social governance at a macro level. Is that a fair summary?
It's absolutely my view. I worry a lot that there are a lot of trade-offs that need to be considered. I just gave you one. Yes, we want to solve the climate change problem, but we shouldn't then, basically relegate 1.5 billion people to poverty or force disorderly migration because we haven't been more thoughtful about innovative ways to deliver energy. Diversity is another one. Yes, absolutely. Having more diversity, whether it's women, whether it's on race, whether it's on thought, is critical for success. No company is going to be successful in the future without that. But at the same time, it would be foolhardy to fight discrimination with discrimination. So we don't want to lose white guys who are adding value and who can help drive success. So it is about balance. And of course, data privacy is another one where, yes, we want privacy, but we need big data to solve for vaccines and for cancer cures. So we've got to straddle these lines in a way that's constructive, experimental, but also sustainable over the long term.
Wow, very cool. So many things that we could follow up on, which we don't have time, but I guess I want to go to the ostensible subject of this session, which is, will America's system win the global ideological battle, which is fundamentally with China. You are African American at this point, but you have this view. What's your answer to that question right now? If you were to say right now, would you say America's system is likely to win long-term, or China's, or something else?
Well, so here's the thing. There's no doubt about it that in all elements of national security, economic growth, in terms of technology development, China has a compelling story. But I would definitely not bet against the United States. The question is, what does the United States have to do in order to regain its competitive footing, or certainly enhance its competitive footing, not just in the United States, but globally, for people around the world to say, hey, wait a second, that's a model we want to pursue. And I would argue a lot of the things that need to be done are very US focused. We're spending way too much time worrying about what China's doing. Forget about China. We need government intervention and infrastructure, which of course the Biden recent proposal does have that. And I'm not just talking about infrastructure like roads and railways and ports, which are graded D+ by the American Society of Civil Engineers. I'm talking about digital, which is in that proposal, but in a real sense. Another thing is we need government to be much more visionary. Harking back to the Manhattan Project, DARPA, the development of Silicon Valley, the government in the United States was visionary, was involved, was not just grasping at short-term solutions. To the extent that we can get that back on train, I do believe that the United States is a place not worth, don't bet against it. And of course, the other arguments are very well known. I've written extensively on this. The United States is ring fenced. It's got very good dependency on its own energy sources, great dependency on its clean air. It's got a wonderful, it's got a culture of immigration and great talent. And really a tip of the spear in a lot of the innovations that are coming. So as far as I'm concerned, I would never bet against the United States. But that said, China is definitely giving the world a sense that, recognizing China was the largest economy in the world in the 1700s, it's very clearly vying for that position. It is the largest provider of debt now to the emerging markets, largest foreign direct investor, largest trading partner of many countries, developed and developing. And so I think it's about putting your own gas mask on in the United States before trying to assist others.
Well, also, if you're presuming, the likelihood that the U.S. is going to be able to make the progress that you said is necessary to retain its preeminence as a model, or at least it's to stay even on par, given the political gridlock in the United States, is not. I'm not terribly optimistic about that. But that's just
there are a lot of reasons not to be optimistic when you see what type of engagements going on. But the United States, if nothing else, has got a reputation of resetting when it gets to these corner solutions that just are not viable. So if you were asking me about other countries, I'd be like, wow, this is probably the time to short. I wouldn't short the U.S. I think fundamentally we get it right at some points, and hopefully it's sooner rather than later.
I'm glad you said that, but let me ask you about the human rights point, because this is one where people in the United States are so quick to condemn China. But I know you believe that, especially from the perspective when you go to Zambia and you talk to people about it, they don't really see it as that clear cut. Am I right?
Well, I think it's hard to go around the world and point fingers about the Uyghurs or elsewhere when you see what's happened with George Floyd. And thank God we had the result that came out yesterday through a transparent and a judicious system. But I think the United States should not pretend that things are perfect. And I think that to the extent that you're not able to clean things up in your own backyard, it does create an Achilles heel when sort of trying to be a standard bearer of values and humanity elsewhere in the world. So again, it goes back to this whole notion that the U.S. has to basically be a leader, not by just espousing certain values, but really showing in evidence that they actually live by them too.
Yeah. I'm not holding my breath, but I do believe it's possible. So thank you for giving us that exhortation. But I know you also are a huge believer in investing in China despite the tensions, and that you don't think enough people recognize that that's really still part of what we need.
Yeah, so look at the numbers. The rough estimates are about 2% is earmarked towards investing in China by big pension funds and other institutional investors. I basically, by shorthand, think China is very much where the United States was in the 1950s. You've got a government that's very explicitly investing in infrastructure and future technologies, very supportive of its own consumption or consumerism at home, and is going to do anything it can to drive that. And so I think there's a lot of upside in China. There are lots of ways to invest in China. And, again, if I had to take a big step back, other regions of the world, Europe, emerging markets have performed incredibly poorly. And I think they could be into a downdraft, everything else citrus paribus. But I think that the Chinese story is very compelling. You've got a government that's very determined. And I think in that respect, I think investors, whether they're endowments and institutional investors, should be looking to increase their exposure there.
I think a lot of Americans may be surprised to hear you talking that way, but I'm glad it's the kind of dialogue we like to sponsor here. It's unexpected. There's at least one question from Abraham Joseph, which very dubiously asking whether it's possible for a country like ours with such a sclerotic system and such a short-term view of almost everything to really successfully compete long-term. But rather than ask you we've already sort of answered that, but and this is kind of going to have to be more or less the final question. I know one of the things that you talk a lot about, the phrases that you haven't used exactly in this conversation are the value of liberal democracy and market capitalism vis-a-vis the alternatives. But then we have Europe as a middle ground in a way. I mean, do you see, if you believe, as I know you do, in liberal democracy and market capitalism, do you think it might end up that Europe becomes the better flag bearer of that than the United States if we remain, a country beset with racism, unable to really take ourselves, improve our healthcare system quickly enough to include everyone fast enough to build our infrastructure back better. Obviously Biden is trying really hard. He's doing some huge, I mean, the 20% figure you said before, that's pretty unprecedented since World War II, right? What about Europe though? And this unfortunately will have to be the last.
Yeah, so listen, I think the jury's still out. Europe has enormous challenges. They're trying to hold the EU together. Obviously, some adults have left the room with Brexit. And I think that a lot of the challenges that you see in the United States, issues of racism and sort of integration of different cultures, as well as lack of infrastructure. They've got a declining population. Immigration is a big issue. I think that there are a lot of issues that they would have to solve. They are absolutely at the tip of the spear in terms of regulation. But, again, you cannot grow an economy by focusing on risk mitigation. You have to have a narrative of why people should invest in these economies, and why should they invest in your companies. And I think that's where the focus needs to be. So too much of, oh gosh, we need to focus on downside is not going to help in the long term. And I think that's what Europe needs to sort of sharpen its tools on in terms of its articulation of why.
Okay, here's another last question. You're writing this book on boards. Do you want to go on more boards, or is it too enough work for you? I can see a lot of companies would like to have you on their board.
Well, listen, I will, let's just say I never closed the door. I'm actually on 3 boards. I'm on a private company as well, Condé Nast, which is a media company.
I didn't realize you were on Condé Nast.
Yes,
wow, cool.
It's a privately owned, family-owned business since 1909. Phenomenal, just history. But the fact of the matter is, keep an open mind. I do keep an open mind. Life changes. I've been on many boards over the past decade or so, and I'm always interested to hear about what other opportunities lie out there.
Well, Dambisa, thank you so much for joining us. You're really fun to talk to, I must say, and you know so much. Thanks again.
See you next time. Bye-bye.